What's going on, guys? This is Tower number 9. I am unfortunately still a little sick here, so my apologies for the delay on this video. But today we're going to do the next tournament video here. So if you've been following along with my previous tournament videos, I was able to go 3-0 in the group phase, and now we're moving on to top 8. So in the top 8 here, I am going to be playing the same Cunning Sabine, and I'm running up against Boba, but this time it's aggression Boba rather than Boba command. So we're gonna see how this one goes. And going into this, I hadn't played very recently against a Boba command deck, or a Boba aggression deck. I think Boba command was a lot more common, and maybe even Boba cunning. I had seen a bunch of people playing because of the recent cunning cards that had been released. So was not as familiar with this matchup, but briefly, Boba Command has the ramping aspect and has overwhelming barrage, and can potentially play the like powerful Star Destroyer type units as a top end of the curve. Boba Aggression doesn't have some of those benefits, but it has some very efficient. It does have some very efficient pieces it can play. So you can do stuff like Imperial Interceptor, for instance, is quite strong in the space arena. Um, One thing that I think Sabine often kind of wants to go towards space against Boba, but the Imperial Interceptor can help impede that. You can also see cards like Open Fire. That's just some straightforward removal. But yeah, I'm gonna lead off with the Green Squadron A-Wing. 2-cost 1/3 with Raid 2, +2/+0 while attacking. My opponent plays an ISB agent here. Reveals an Asteroid Sanctuary to deal 1 damage to my Green Squadron A-Wing. I end up taking the initiative here. And my opponent uses Tarkin Town to kill the damaged A-Wing, gets a resource back with Boba Fett, then spends a resource to play Greedo, and then actually is actually able to spend the other resource to play a TIE LN. So this is an extremely strong start for my opponent. I am substantially behind after this first turn. The main thing that I have going for me is that my opponent has played a bunch of cards that are like relatively lower impact cards. So, my opponent has spent 3 cards here, and maybe I'm going to be able to get some and use the base actually, and maybe I'm going to be able to get some more value through this other stuff. So we see I deploy the Fighters for Freedom. My opponent has Greedo attack the base here. So I could use Sabine's ability, but given this start and how favorable it is for my opponent, I actually don't want to because I don't feel that I'm actually the beatdown in this situation. I feel like I need to try and stabilize after a really unfortunate start rather than trying to push damage through and rush there. And then we see a 7th Fleet Defender added to my opponent's board as well. So really not what I want to see. This turn I will be able to deploy Sabine. Depending on what exactly I do, I can maybe play some red cards that are going to give me free damage with the Fighters for Freedom. So there are some upsides there. Overall, though, this board is very unfavorable. One thing I can do here is I can have the Fighters for Freedom kill Greedo. Greedo will potentially kill them if my opponent hits the top deck, but if he doesn't, the Fighters for Freedom will remain alive and be able to damage the opponent with their ability, also potentially doing other stuff. So I actually decide I remove Greedo with Open Fire to eliminate the chance of my opponent lucking out. Because there is that risk that the opponent will top deck an event and kill the Fighters for Freedom if that was the way that it went. That way I do also push 1 damage to the enemy base. Then I'm probably going to deploy Sabine here and then use Infiltrator's skill. That will be another damage to the base, and it will, develop my board a bit as well. We see, so in that case, I accidentally subtract life or I subtract damage instead of adding it. Sometimes people go 25 counting down, sometimes 0 counting up. 0 counting up for damage is, I think, more accurate to how the game is going to be played in person because it's not really a life total like you would have in Magic the Gathering where you can go above your base level. It's like physical counters being put on your base to represent damage. So now I deploy Sabine. My opponent still has 4 resources here. Could easily lock down Sabine here. We can see that Asteroid Sanctuary, for instance. That is what we see. So Sabine gets exhausted by Asteroid Sanctuary. Sorry, guys. I'm still a little ill. The shield token here doesn't get a ton of value, so it could go on the ISB agent. It could go on the tie. Ends up going to ISB agent. So then I have 1 resource left, so I could take the initiative here, or I could deploy the infiltrator skill. In this situation, I end up going to deploy the infiltrator skill. I actually put it on the Fighters for Freedom instead of Sabine. I think I think the reason I did this is to get them out of range of Boba so that he can't attack and kill them in one hit. ISB agent hits Sabine for 1. I take the initiative. So I have some solid cards here. I can do I can play Wing Leader buff Sabine and then also go for the Leia Organa Defiant Princess to exhaust Boba once he deploys. I am at an overall life disadvantage, and the space arena is looking bad, but the ground arena currently is seen as pretty favorable for me. And the Wing Leader is maybe going to at least be able to divert an attack from the opponent, and if he doesn't attack the Wing Leader and just tries to push damage to my base, I can trade it with that tie. My opponent plays a Waylay on the Fighters for Freedom here. Okay. That's one other argument for putting the Infiltrator skill on Sabine. I think that probably would have been a better play, in fact. I'm going to have Sabine hit the enemy base here. That's going to be 5 total damage. So one thing I could do here is I can pass and wait for Boba to deploy. The problem is if I go for this passing option, my opponent will end up with the initiative. So I actually decide that I'm going to play out Leia Defiant Princess early and use her to exhaust that tie, I believe, um, which will be more favorable timing-wise, allowing me to take the initiative. But I am getting kind of low on damage. I'm getting kind of low on base HP here. And my opponent brings out Boba Disintegrator, which is a very unwelcome development, as well as Boba Fett himself. Now, my opponent is at a 0 cards in hand, so is in top deck mode here, but is ahead enough on life that I'm not sure it matters. I'm in pretty desperate straits here. So I have some options that I can use to inflict damage on the enemy base, but I'm probably just going to be defeated here. I don't have anything that can incredibly stabilize the ground arena. And I could have Boba, so like I could surprise strike Boba with Sabine and kill him, and then but even if I do that, my opponent still has 3 damage from Boba Disintegrator plus the space arena unit. So I do go for that surprise strike. My thinking here is like, okay, I can defeat Boba, and if my opponent kind of loses sight of the objective and has Boba Disintegrator defeat Sabine, which is a high value play, it buys me time. But my opponent is playing this smart, doesn't fall for it, pushes damage to the base, and at this point I'm kind of stuck. There's the 7th Fleet Defender can attack and defeat my base, and there's not a lot I can do about it at this point. I could actually have, so I can kind of tell the game's over. But I actually check in. I'm like, wait a minute. Does this game allow? Does this game have life remaining on base as a relevant tiebreaker? And I think we had decided that we weren't sure if it did. We weren't sure if that would be a tiebreaker if we like went 1-1 and ran out of time. Not that that's going to happen. So I end up doing the surprise strike with the. I play the other surprise strike with my wing leader to hit the enemy base and just get closer. 5 damage there, and then the 7th Fleet Defender attacks and destroys my base. So, unfavorable situation there for me. Ended up doing some damage, but the opponent was able to gain a big advantage early on with that. The opponent was able to gain a big advantage early on with the ISB agent Tarkentown play on the first turn. Being able to play 3. So it's just extremely abnormal to be able to play 3 1-cost units and kill your opponent's initial drop on the first turn, and it was difficult for me to come back after that. I fought, but I was unsuccessful at stabilizing the situation. And so now we're going to go for a rematch here, and we're going to see how this goes. So because of the ISB agent pings, I'm adding in my disabling Fang fighters as a sideboard here, and I'm going to replace my wing leaders. Or I'm sorry, not wing leaders, my Star Wing scouts. I'm also going to add a single shoot first, and I don't remember exactly what I sub out for that. It might be a waylay or something. There is some argument that I should actually substitute Chewbacca in here to try to give me something that will stabilize me if my opponent has a bunch of smaller units. That is a threat that I need to be aware of against this deck, but I don't end up doing it, I think. So yeah, now I'm removing the Star Wing scouts. And this is kind of the advantage of sideboarding. You get to these situations where it's like, okay, Star Wing Scout is unusually vulnerable to ISB agent, and that could be really catastrophic. So I'm going to substitute it out and then adding another shoot first to help contest the early game situation with both players having good early game units. On the plus side, I do get to go first here. Um, draw a this is a pretty decent hand, so I can lead off with Sabine Wren here, and I have some solid plays to move into from there. Resource a rogue operative, and I think an open fire here. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna lead off with Sabine Wren. And 2/3 with on attack, you may deal 1 damage to the defender or a base. And my opponent has the same ISB agent combo as in the first game, with ISB agent on the first turn, shows a waylay, 1 damage to Sabine, and we'll be able to follow it up with Tarkentown. I do end up just taking the initiative here. And then yeah, we do see Tarkentown used for the immediate kill, getting the resource back with Boba. And and then with 2 resources, we can potentially see. In this case, it's going to be, I think, a single tie and no additional unit, but still a really strong start for my opponent. Um, and this is something that this deck can do that other decks don't really have as much access to, and I think it's actually very powerful. The potential to remove your opponent's initial drop, get a resource back, and play another 1 or even 2 units on the first turn is just like really setting you up strong. The problem with that, of course, is that if it doesn't work, then you've really spent a lot in order to get something that's not that valuable. So I'm going to deploy Leia Organa Defiant Princess using her ability to stand up a resource, and then I'm going to play a Lothal Insurgent. My reasoning here is that given that my opponent has a pretty strong start, I want to develop my own board, get units out, and be fighting for the board quickly. In a situation where my Sabine had stuck on field, I probably would have gone for the I am a stronger individual unit, the Rogue Operative, but I want to develop more units and kind of fight it out with my opponent's units here and get control of the situation rather than necessarily pushing for all aggro all the time. Could be wrong, but we'll see. And then the random discard from the local insurgent actually takes out a Fet's Fire Spray. I'm very happy to see that. Fet's Fire Spray is kind of the powerful top of the curve card for the Boba build. At least I think there is some chance a deck like this could be running the Emperor or something, but I think most likely not, just based on what Boba's cost curve normally looks like. All right, so we're gonna see 3 resources spent for Boba Disintegrator. I'm taking the initiative here, not using Sabine's ability. 1 damage to my base from the ISB agent. Another Leia here and another Leia and a wing leader. Some pretty decent cards. Yeah. Awkwardly though, I don't have any really good trades here with my enemy's units, or my opponent's units. Enemy is a little overstated, I think. It's a friendly game. Um, so we'll see how this one goes. I could have my Lothal Insurgent take out the ISB agent, but it doesn't seem worth it. I have Leia Organa Defiant Princess hit the enemy base for 2. This is actually kind of a bait. I'm hoping that my opponent uses Boba Disintegrator to defeat Leia here, because it would allow me to replay the other Leia that I have in hand. So at this point, I'm going to deploy Sabine. I'm actually more pushing damage here than I would be in other situations. Still have the Lothal Insurgent. Can potentially buff Sabine with the Wing Leader. My opponent plays Greedo. What do we got here? So I could go for Wing Leader here. I could go for I could go for the Rogue Operative, but I'm not sure the Rogue Operative is great right here. I still have that Leia waiting. I could use that to exhaust Boba Disintegrator, for instance. But the problem is, because I already have a Leia in play, I would be defeating the one that already exists. So that's not really very high value. So I end up going for Sabine buff with the Wing Leader instead. Now I could have used the Wing Leader on the Lothal Insurgent and then had him take out Boba Disintegrator. That would be an option. Opponent's going for the base. Let's see what's going on here. So we do have the option of having of trying to take out Greedo here. I am behind on life but ahead on board right now. So the question is, do I want to fight my opponent's units? Do I want to what am I trying to do? So I have the Lothal Insurgent take out the ISB agent. I'm trying to I'm trying to stabilize and sort of get control of the board right now. My opponent takes the initiative. Sabine can still attack. She can do 5 total damage to the base. She can also just pick off Greedo, but I think I end up having her just hit the base here. A lot of options here. So with Leia Defiant Princess, I can exhaust Boba. Again, though, since I already have a Leia in play, it's a little awkward. So what I might want to do is take the trade with Leia for Greedo, in which case I will clear Greedo off the board, and then also Leia will be defeated, and I'll have another one waiting. So an open fire here is actually used on Sabine. 4 damage on Sabine. Puts her in a position where Boba Disintegrator can defeat her. So one thing that I can do to counter here is I can actually play another Wing Leader and buff Sabine further, getting her out of range. Right now, Boba or Greedo would defeat her in one shot. If I play the Wing Leader and buff her, it gets her out of that zone. I use Leia to defeat Boba here, or to defeat Greedo here, which I think is sort of an error because it leaves Sabine vulnerable to being picked off by Boba. Um, Opponent misses the Greedo discard. I think the Wing Leader play might have been better here to buff Sabine, get her out of range. And my opponent could have attacked Sabine with Greedo and gone for the luck, and would have been able to defeat her in the event of top decking an event or attachment, but it wouldn't have paid off in this situation. Boba Disintegrator now on 1 life, but still in the game. I have sort of gained an advantage in terms of like overall damage, etc. at this point. Do you still have the ability to exhaust Boba the leader once he deploys, thanks to Leia? Deploy a Wing Leader, buffing my other Wing Leader. So that now that Wing Leader can potentially defeat that tie. But in the current situation, it's arguable that I want to switch game plans and start pushing damage to the enemy base because I have a significantly better board right now. My opponent deploys Boba, and I'm going to exhaust him with Leia Defiant Princess. And yeah, now I can potentially push 7 damage to the base here and get my opponent close to the danger zone. And so the tie the tie there takes out the tie there takes out 2 more damage to my base rather than trading with the wing leader. I think at this point I have not the initiative of the game concept, but I have the like I'm pushing more damage initiative. And so at this point I'm actually happy to try and close out the game with more damage to the base rather than continuing to try to stabilize on the field. So my opponent has the initiative here. And this is where against Command Sabine I would be very worried about overwhelming barrage, but it's not a factor. It's not a factor against aggression Sabine, which means that my board of smaller units is a lot less vulnerable than it would otherwise be. A barrage here from Boba would be able to wipe almost all my board. Like he could kill the yeah, like everything except for one of the wing leaders or everything except for Leia or whatever. Boba hits my base, but I'm pushing damage to the enemy base, and I actually have a surprise strike here, so I'm feeling pretty good about this situation. So my opponent is continuing to just push damage to the base here, but I actually think that in this situation, it would be better for my opponent to try to stabilize and clear my units. It's sort of an interesting situation where the role of like who is the aggressor in the game has kind of changed throughout this game, where I felt like at the start it was my opponent who was the aggro and I was trying to stabilize, and then it kind of shifted and I became the aggressor with my opponent ideally trying to stabilize. My opponent kept up with the offensive gameplay here, and I was able to get the win. A Fet's Fire Spray does come out there, so it would have been able to get me down to 1 life if that Fet's Fire Spray and TLN had attacked. Maybe even could have won the game if there were a surprise strike or something, but wasn't able to get it. Okay, so then we're 1-1, and we're gonna go to game 3 and see how it goes. Now, I do think this is a disadvantage for Sabine in some ways because the Sabine's ability pushes damage to both bases, so it's good when you're the aggressor. But in a matchup where you're potentially not the aggressor, her ability can be actually a liability because in those situations you really don't want to be the one you really don't want to be the one who's doing damage to both bases. You want to be trying to secure favorable trades and stabilizing the board. So in this situation, we'll see how it goes. But we're going for game 3. So I don't change my sideboarding. I would be curious to see whether or not I haven't tested this matchup that much. I would be curious to see whether or not that Chewbacca is a good sideboard card to include in this matchup. I'm not 100% sure, but I could at least conceivably see it being useful. All right. So we got round 3. I think my opponent is looking at the sideboard here. I ultimately don't make any changes. Let's see how this goes. All right. Round 3. And the winner of this round will advance into the next phase of the tournament. So this is the top 8 Winner will advance to round top four, which is the semifinal. This is a single elimination though, so the loser of this game will be knocked out of the tournament. You know, hashtag no pressure or whatever. Here we go. All right, here we go. So once again, I have some pretty good starting options. I could do the Alliance X-Wing or Sabine Wren. One rule of thumb in some of these situations, if it's two aggressive decks against each other, is that you want to deploy to the arena where your opponent is not. Um, so as an example, if my opponent deploys to the ground arena, I might want to deploy to the space arena. If my opponent deploys to space, I might want to deploy to ground. That minimizes the chance that you get blown out by cards like Shoot First. Conversely, if you have the initiative, you're hoping that your opponent is in the same arena as you in the battle of aggressive decks. All right, so I'm going to resource a Fang Fighter. End up resourcing a Shoot First here since I have a similar trick in the Fleet Lieutenant. Normally, Shoot First should be a pretty strong card here, but I think a Fleet Lieutenant as my next play might be reasonable. Opponent plays a Death Star Stormtrooper. So I'm going to avoid going to the ground arena. I play an Alliance X-Wing. And once again, my opponent has the ISB agent doing damage to my X-Wing here by revealing a no good to me dead. I actually use Sabine's ability here, one damage to each base. And my opponent opts to take the initiative instead of playing instead of using Tarkentown. I think that's favorable for me in my opinion. But I think it's conceivable, my opponent doesn't have another one drop in hand or something, doesn't end up getting much value other than killing my unit. But I was definitely expecting that unit to be picked off by Tarkentown, and I think it might have been better for my opponent to do that. Hard to say. I think in that situation, my opponent wanted to retain the initiative. Stormtrooper hits my base for 3. Not loving that. I'm gonna go Fleet Lieutenant. X-Wing swings in for 4. And that also develops a 3/3 unit that I can potentially use against my opponent. We see a hit there from the ISB agent. I use Sabine's ability. So I don't think using Sabine's ability here is necessarily correct. I ended up using it here because in the last game it felt like I ended up being the aggressor, and I was trying to, maybe push things towards a conclusion before Fett's Fire Spray and stuff like that can make a big impact. Um, Ultimately, my opponent doesn't have a play this turn, which I'm pretty happy to see. Honestly, it could be a lot worse for me. But I do know there might be that no good to me dead coming, which would be pretty unfavorable. So we'll see how this goes. I do have a shoot first, which I could use. So my opponent plays an interceptor to take down the Alliance X-Wing. That's one of the, in my opinion, key strong plays from this deck. So in this situation, I could shoot first to kill the Death Star Stormtrooper, um, which would then leave my lieutenant on the field. But I think I opt to just push more damage to the base. So in this situation, I am playing it as the aggressor. I'm not entirely sure that's correct. End up deploying, or actually, I use Sabine's ability first, maybe, and then deploy her. Not exactly sure. One advantage is that my opponent has spent enough resources that there isn't going to be that no good to me dead coming out this turn, so I'm not worried about that. Yeah, use Sabine's ability. ISB agent hits my base for an additional 1. Sabine deploys. So now I think maybe now I use the shoot first to kill this stormtrooper while also doing 1 damage to the enemy base with Sabine. Not entirely sure. My opponent plays Greedo. Maybe I shoot first on Greedo. I don't really remember, but I think I do have Sabine kill an enemy unit here. And I will also be able to play the Millennium Falcon and have it take out that interceptor and remain alive, or just push damage to the enemy base. Personally, in this situation, looking at it now, it sort of feels to me like I should be taking the advantage on the board rather than just trying to race like crazy, but hard to say. I could also have Sabine, so I could just have Sabine hit the enemy base for 3, and then deploy the Falcon and have it hit the enemy base for 3. Do 6 damage to the enemy. Get it real close to potentially defeat. Honestly, that might be better. I don't think that's a crazy play at all. I do end up going, well, so I'm thinking about how to do this. So I basically have to choose between killing my opponent's units or pushing more damage to the base or whatever. So I have Sabine shoot first into the Stormtrooper. I think the reason that I did this is because if I hit Greedo, he could potentially damage my Fleet Lieutenant and then use Tarkin Town on it. So I then deploy the Falcon, and I used Jeddah City to remove the damage from the Interceptor, and then take it out with the Falcon so that the Falcon is safe from Tarkin Town. So I'm trying to counterplay my opponent's base here. This turn I could potentially play Sabine the unit and also play a Green Squadron A-Wing. Develop my board further. The main downside that I have at this time is that I don't really have a good way to deal with Boba Fett. There's no Leia Defiant Princess this time to exhaust him when he deploys. My opponent plays out the Forced Choke here to defeat Sabine. I draw a card. Sorry about that, guys. I'm actually lagging a bit here, so I don't see the card that I've drawn. I tell my opponent to flip it, unflip it. Sorry about that. Little trick on TTS, if you draw a card but can't see it, ask your opponent to flip and unflip it in your hand, and this sometimes makes it become visible, which I think is what we do here. I was on I was in a relatively rural area in the Czech Republic, didn't have great internet. Yeah, so we see a Lothal insurgent there. So 11-11. I can push 6 damage to the enemy base this turn. My opponent can potentially deal 8 damage to my base, though, which isn't great. I can develop my board further, but I don't really have any direct answers. I end up deciding to push damage, which I don't think this was, with the benefit of hindsight, I don't think this is really the correct way to play this. I think that I should have either, so then we see no good to me dead, exhausting the Falcon. This is less good than using it on other units in that I can, if I want, return the Falcon to hand and then replay it to have it ready next turn. But it does still impede me here. Boba still hasn't deployed. So I think in this situation, I probably should have either gone harder on pushing damage to the enemy base on the previous turn, or else I should have gone for more taking out enemy units this turn. I think I ended up with like a weird sense of what exactly the game plan was, and it feels a little unfocused. So, for instance, I could have pushed 6 more damage on the previous turn at the cost of, or actually, it would have been 7 more damage if I had played that shoot first just for base damage. Um, which would have left my opponent like quite close to defeat. Um, however, didn't end up doing that. There's also the possibility of this turn using that Fleet Lieutenant to trade with Greedo or something, restricting the amount of damage that can go to my base, but not the way that I ultimately played it. So it's interesting to think about some of these alternatives and like different ways to play this. I think this is an interesting matchup in that like who should or shouldn't be being aggressive can really change from turn to turn. Um, My opponent deploys Boba. No real answer for that, unfortunately, so I'll take 4 damage here. Alright, so 18-14. I'm really hoping for a surprise strike or fleet lieutenant or something that's going to let me get that surprise extra damage into my opponent's base. A Leia Defiant Princess would also be great as an option to shut down my opponent's Boba. My opponent actually plays another no good to me dead, keeping my Sabine unable to attack. This is like a kind of low value play, but given how close the situation has become, I think it's worth it. So in this situation, what I can do is I can actually, so I can Fleet Lieutenant the A-Wing into the enemy base for 5, and then play the Falcon and hit for 3, but that's just not enough damage, and my opponent has lethal. So at this point, I'm basically just hoping that my opponent misplays this somehow. And if there were one less removal piece here from my opponent, or like control piece, I would be able to have lethal this turn. As it stands, though, I do not. So that's going to be 5 damage. Tough spot to be where you're basically just hoping your opponent messes it up, though. I take 3 damage there from Greedo, deploy the Falcon, and really I'm just hoping my opponent misplays because Boba can just attack and win the game. It is possible. So there's the Falcon. That's potentially 3 more damage. But my opponent does not horribly misplay it, just hits my base and wins the game. So congratulations to my opponent for picking up the win there. It was an interesting game. I think ultimately if I had pushed more damage to the enemy base, I might have won. It's hard to say. Um, or if I had gone further with trying to fight for the board, I might have won. Hard to say there also, but I think ultimately I kind of split the difference in the mid game there and ended up getting kind of the benefit of neither. So unfortunate situation there, but ultimately a fun game. And with that, my opponent wins this match 2-1, and I am knocked out of the elims. So that was my tournament experience. Ultimately went 3-1 for the day in terms of matches, and in terms of individual games, I think I was, what was it, 7-3. So overall, I think, overall I felt pretty good about that result. Didn't seem terrible. And you know, definitely some things to think about. The aggression Boba to me seems probably stronger than Command Boba into Sabine. The potential of that ISB agent Tarkintown start is really strong, and you have some core things that you can use to kind of get control of the situation. So, forced choke, we saw that defeat Sabine easily in this game. We saw Imperial Interceptor, which is very efficient against those small ships. It does seem to me like there's just a fair few options that it has that are maybe better than the ones that Command has access to. The main thing that Aggression does not have that Command does is the ramp, overwhelming barrage, and some of the late game ships. If your plan is that the top end of your curve is going to be Fett's fire spray anyway, though, maybe that's not that big a deal. So interesting, ultimately an interesting situation. I do think that the aggression deck can kind of run out of steam. It has a lot of cheap cards, and if it spends a bunch of the cards but the opponent stabilizes anyway, that does seem like it can be a bad scenario. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one, guys. Thanks to you all for watching. I'll have links to the deck lists from the tournament and my other tournament videos in the video description below. And yeah, hoping that I will get over this illness pretty soon. And apologies for releasing this one a little later today. Thanks to you all for watching, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content.